The Exit Series is produced for general information and educational purposes only and is not investment, legal, or tax advice. Views expressed are those of the host and the guest and do not necessarily reflect those of any affiliated firm. The host is associated with an SEC-registered investment advisor. Nothing herein constitutes an offer or solicitation of advisory services. Guests are not necessarily clients. This is the Exit Series. I'm Bob Roark. This is for founders, brokers, attorneys, and valuation professionals, the people who are in the room when the deal closed or before, talking about what happens next. This is the conversation nobody else is having. On this episode, we have Vince Vavrunek. He is the founder of Rising Branch and Transworld Business Advisors of Jackson, Mississippi. Vince built a ServPro franchise from the ground up, ran it for over 12 years, and successfully sold it. Now he helps other business owners plan their exits and get to the closing table. Vince, welcome. Tell us a bit about your work and who you serve.
Well, thank you, Bob, for reaching out and inviting me on. It's an honor, and hopefully this will be, good information for your listeners and for business owners if they're tuning in, or even colleagues. I'm in Jackson, Mississippi, which is the central part of the state. It's the capital. It's the largest place in metro area. We're not a big state, but we have a lot of small businesses here. And so my typical client is a business owner that is looking to transition, whether that's selling, exiting, preparing to exit, legacy, transition. There's a lot of questions that come up. And so for me, it's something I've walked through myself, and that's how we'll get into talking how I got into this industry. But that's mostly what I do. I also help them with valuation as well. If they want to know what the business is worth, I partner with a certified valuation analyst that helps me prepare a standard valuation, run some industry comps, benchmark them to their NAICS code. And so that's kind of, those are the two main buckets for business owners. And then I also am a commercial real estate broker with a brokerage here. So if they have the real estate component that runs with the business, I can help them and make, one-stop shop, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Well, you built ServPro of Brandon, which is just outside of Jackson, correct?
That's correct. That's right.
No, and you built it from a startup into a 24/7 emergency restoration business over 12 and a half years. Walk me through what that business looked like at its peak and what your day-to-day looked like before you decided to sell.
So ServPro was very good at developing processes, and they always said, follow this system. And, that's a buzzword. Sometimes people, what does that mean? Follow the system. And well, ServPro's model was to develop a fully managed business. And what did that look like? Well, at the peak, if you were running a fully managed business, you would have all of the different divisions. That's sales, office, production. And then you also had different service lines. So fire, water, mold. And then later on, to the end of my journey with them, we implemented construction, reconstruction, recon, people call it. And so at the peak, we were running a fully managed business. And that business had all of the components. They were very good at helping us visualize our org chart. They called it the stages model. And so if you were doing X in volume, you should have these people on the bus, and they should be in this seat on the bus. And if you're in between, then you need to add, think about, you're going to get to this point, you need to add. And so they had a really good system, and they just said, follow the system. And so what did that look like inside? So that's like, in a manual, a fully managed system. But what it looked like on the inside of the business was, I was managing the managers. So, like a lot of the business books out there that you might read, the E-Myth Revisited by Michael Gerber, probably one of my favorites, working on the business instead of in the business. In ServPro, they said you got to get off the truck. And in the E-Myth, you got to stop baking the cookies and you got to start working on the business. And so managing the managers, empowering those managers with decision making, and then also holding them accountable, but also rewarding them when they did really good things, recognizing them, and retaining the team. And so at the peak, I would say, that's the bulk of it. And then something personally, when I really think about it, one of the things that you have to do in that business is you're mostly paid by the insurance companies. So for property damage restoration, it's usually an insurance claim. So you're going to have to work through that process. And so not only is Mrs. Jones your client, but actually you're trying to collect your money from the insurance company. And so they might not necessarily be your client on paper, but they're paying your bill. And so they usually don't get in a hurry. So you have to develop a process to manage your accounts receivable. You've got to be prepared to float that. And so I developed an AR, accounts receivable collection process in my office. And at one time, according to our regional trainership, I was the fastest collecting franchise for 3 years running. And so they asked me to come and give a presentation to an owners conference about what I did and how I look, I don't have a magic wand and it wasn't rocket science, but I found out very early on that a lot of people were producing the work and then just expecting the money to show up in the mailbox.
That doesn't generally happen with an insurance company, not generally.
No, I mean, you've got adjusters, you've got desk adjusters, internal adjusters, you've got consultants. And depending on how large the loss is, if it's large, you have multiple parties that are involved. And there's audit, there's estimating, scrubbing companies now, there's TPAs, third party administrators. So you might be working through a lot of different stuff and expecting that money to just show up in your mailbox. Like Zig Ziglar used to say, you can't hope your way to the top. And so I didn't hope that money was going to show up.
Well, was there a moment when you decided, or was that something you'd been keeping an eye on just from the very beginning?
Well, and I don't want to really dive a whole lot into the previous career that got me into ServPro, but I was in furniture manufacturing and I was a sales rep for a family office called Franklin Furniture. And we sold to the top 100 retailers in the country. And Hassel Franklin was the founder. And I worked for him and I had the home territory. So I was at the factory a lot. And then one of the things I learned about, a lot of people might not know what this is something called factoring. And so we factored all of our invoices through a company called CIT. And that's a financial institution. And Mr. Franklin was very, very involved in the collection process and the credit monitoring of his clients, probably because he's been burned before. He'd been in business since 1967. And so very early on, he was instilling in me and all the other reps, hey, it's very important that our clients are credit worthy, that we're monitoring their credit worthiness, that they're passing the factoring through. Every invoice was factored, by the way, Bob. So like you could pay great today, and in a month I come back, you write another order and you're slow in the trade. CIT might hold that order. And so he was very adamant about collecting that money in a quick manner. And so that bled over into ServPro. I was like, hey, wait a minute. I'm not getting paid as quick as I would like to. And I ran that AR aging summary report in QuickBooks, which I didn't know I had such a love for financial reports. I'm not an accounting major or a financial analyst, but when I got QuickBooks and I got my hands on those reports, I was like, okay, now I got some things I can work on. and I can use them every day.
You know, I think a lot of folks arrive at that usually at a calamity, and then they figure it out after that. But it's really insightful that you could bring it from the previous employer. You know, the thing that's kind of curious for me is, you know, after 12 years of building ServPro, what made you decide that it was time? You know, was there a moment or an insight?
There was. So first of all, we were in a time where we were still owned by the family that founded ServPro. Okay, and um, you know, I was a young owner, um, but I started to see some transitions. I started to see some older people uh, come into the business. When I say older, they were older than me. They were kind of like what we call corporate refugees. Maybe they did some
Mm-hmm.
stints at some pretty big uh, Fortune 500 companies. They had a big nest egg and a 401k. They were able to go through some creative financing like Rob's and different things. I got to witness that from a owner, new owners coming in to the industry, and also it was becoming more expensive for people to buy a ServPro versus when I bought it in 2008. So it was kind of like a progression as the business got bigger, as the enterprise got bigger. Well, obviously, some people, got squeezed out in a way. I don't want not forcefully, but sometimes you can either grow with the business or the business can outgrow you. And for some people, they were just tired, or maybe it wasn't what they signed up for. Technology also played a big factor. Like when I first started, we did everything on with a file and paper. Like we came to your house, we did everything, our monitoring reports, our sketches. Then it moved to an iPad. We developed our own app called Drybook, and I think it catapulted so quickly into another generation of business processes and systems that some of the people couldn't adapt. And I think the business outgrew them, so they got out. So I got to see that happen. And by me seeing that happen, and when I went to a convention, we had a convention every year. ServPro did.
Mm-hmm.
And that's another thing, real quick. I'll tell you the reason why they got us to conventions, not because we just love to go, different places, which we did, but the founder gave 10% of all your royalties paid back to you when you came to convention, no matter how much you paid. 10%. You got half of it when you checked in, and you got the second check on the last day. So you couldn't leave. It was
What was
brilliant.
attendance like then?
It
100%?
was it was off the charts. If you want, yeah, I mean, because it paid for your trip, okay, and in some cases you made money. The larger franchises, they made money. They got to bring their team. It was really more about, hey, not just bring you and your wife, bring your team, bring your leadership team. Let's
Mm-hmm.
invest in them. Let's pour into them. Let's recognize that next generation of leadership, because they know that those people could be owners, or those people could be, in the top seats running the business operation. And it was brilliant. And every 10 years, they don't do this anymore, but I got to experience the first trip to Hawaii in 2010. So I was only in the business 2 years. Probably shouldn't even have went to Hawaii. I don't know if I could afford it, but I did get some royalties to help pay my way. And so we went to Kona for a week. I was only in business like a year and a half. I don't know if that answers your question. We kind of got off on a tangent about the convention and the conferences. But I know what you're asking. How did I know? Well, I
Yeah.
had seen it done a couple of different times. I swam in some of the same waters as some business brokers that sold restoration companies. They came to some of our events. They talked to us. We had some financial institutions that would help get some deals done. And so when the time came, I was off market. I wasn't on market. I wasn't listed for sale. That one of those brokers who was in the restoration space approached me and asked me would I consider selling. And I was like, no, not really. I mean, We're growing, up and to the right, northeastern trend. We're having great success. We've added the construction component. Now we're a full service provider. I said, but let me do one more thing. I said, before I say no, let me ask my wife. And so I deferred to Melissa. And what she said stopped me in my tracks. And I said, hey, got this random call today. The broker that's always at these conventions, I'm talking, yeah. And I said, well, he wanted to know if we would sell. What do you think? And she said, well, if the Lord opens that door, we need to walk through it. And Bob, I'm telling you, I was just like frozen. And I said, oh, okay. Well, what do you mean? And she goes, well, 24-hour emergency service business is a tough business. And, I don't know if this is a forever thing for us. It's been good. It's been a good platform. It's done exactly what we would like it to do. But now would be a good time to reinvent yourself if that's something you're interested in. So that's when I knew.
You say the most expensive mistake a business owner can make is waiting too long to plan their exit. And from what you said, do you think that you had planned along the way to some extent, or were you making it up after you had the offer?
That's a great question. We were planned almost inadvertently. We had been planning. You see, ServPro had the leadership was the second generation of the founder. And they knew that there was going to be a percentage that were going to sell. Not everybody's going to sell. Some people are going to be lifers, right? So hand it down to the second generation. But they knew if they were going to grow the organization and attract quality buyers to take the business to another level, not that owner wasn't good enough to take it to the next level, they knew they had to prepare that business for sale. So at these conferences, we would have breakout sessions. And I remember one of them was like exit planning or how to sell your franchise. And I was like, I'm not going to that. People think I'm selling. I don't want my colleagues to see me in there, and it really wasn't on my radar, but it was always there. And then we would have these regional events, Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, and they would bring in speakers. And then they would also bring in owners that have sold before and talked about what they learned and what they should have done, or what they didn't do. And then every 5 years, I don't know if they still do this or not, but every 5 years you had to go back to corporate Gallatin, Tennessee, and it was called FMC, Franchise Management Class. So you could have been a franchise owner and you could be approaching year 30, and I could be a franchise owner approaching year 5 or 6, and we would both be in the same class. There were like 4 to choose from, okay, throughout the year. And there would probably be like 40 or 50 owners in the room. And basically the room would be, all across the board, generational, how long they've owned it. Sometimes there were second generation franchise owners in there that had been in there for 20 years. So there was a lot of experience. There was also a lot of wet behind the ears, green owners. Well, I'll never forget, I had this guy behind me, and I got to talking to him one night, and he was a little bit older, and he said, my advice to you is to build your business as if you're selling it, and then don't sell it. And when it's time, you'll be ready. And I'm like, well, what does that mean? Like, that's great advice. What does that mean? He said, follow the system. And I'm like, okay. Now, I feel like I'm being brainwashed, right? But like, Bob, I wasn't supposed to reinvent the wheel, and I didn't.
Well, some folks aren't coachable and some are. And so that's not a bad thing to be coachable. Thinking of, so for your sale, you were the seller, not the broker. What did that process feel like from the inside? And was there anything that surprised you about it?
I would say, man, it was an emotional time. I mean, obviously it wasn't like I took over my dad's business and, I had this obligation to carry on this family name or anything like that. But the emotional time was really, I had built a kind of a second family. It was a small business. Yes, I had a team, but I had built some really close relationships. I had poured into a couple of different people, and one of those was my general manager, who had started as a sales rep, and I had taught him everything, and I had learned how to empower him with and learned how to delegate some things to him. And so I'd watched him get married, watched him buy a house, watched him have children, watched him join a small group at church, get involved, get him plugged in, get involved in his children's lives. I mean, like, I was close to him. I'm still close to him. We went to lunch last week, a week and a half ago. And, it's been almost 6 years. And so, I mean, I'm really close to him, and I try to stay involved in his life. And we walked through a lot of seasons. He lost his mom working for us, and just, experienced life together. So my main concern was not necessarily about the legacy of ServPro Brandon or the brand name. It was about my people. And so emotionally, I was like, what are they going to feel? Are they going to hate me? Are they going to feel betrayed? I tried to put myself in their shoes. I know they're not going to understand, like, really, I don't have an ulterior motive. And that's another thing too. Like, I didn't have another plan because it kind of, it caught me off guard. So I had to start processing that. And it did, obviously it didn't happen overnight. You can't just buy a business overnight either. It's not like buying a used car with cash.
You work both on the business brokerage and on the commercial real estate side. A lot of business sales include property. What happens to the deal when the business and the real estate are, tangled together, and how does that change what the seller goes through?
Well, the real estate can be good, and it can also be a disadvantage. It's a hard asset. So banks financing love real estate. The business side can be you're selling a business, Like, you've got goodwill, you've got customer listing, you might have some intellectual property, you've got brand name recognition, whatever you want to call it. And then you've also got a non-compete, most likely, that's going to hold some value. So when you've got kind of break it down allocation of purchase price, you've got all of those things for the business. And then over here, you've got the property, the real estate. Well, in Mississippi, a lot of service businesses own their real estate, or manufacturing or industrial services. So I knew it was important to be able to sell the real estate. And what the real estate can do for you is it can push a deal across the finish line, but it also can serve as a disadvantage. So I'll kind of walk through a couple of examples. Let's say you've got a business and you've got 8 acres and you're on the interstate on a frontage road. You bought it 40 years ago and nothing was out there. And now some things are developing, like a data center, maybe 10 miles down the road, and you think your real estate's worth X. Okay. And you're not using all your 8 acres. You're only using like 4, but you got 8 and you got interstate road frontage. But your real estate's been paid off for 20 years. You haven't, and you're not paying yourself rent. And so your cash flow on your business looks really, really good. But we also have to do what I call normalization of earnings. Because if I'm going to buy your business, I put myself in the buyer's shoes every time. Okay. I put myself in your shoes as a seller every time as well, but I also have to put my buyer hat on. Okay. Well, if I'm going to buy your business and I'm going to buy your real estate, your shop, your 8 acres, and you think your real estate is worth a lot of money and you're not paying yourself rent, well, now I have to buy your business. Now I have to buy your real estate. And now I've got new debt service that you're not servicing. And so in our business, we say the deal's got a pencil. Okay. And if the real estate prevents the deal from penciling, which means this, I can't service the debt, or I can only service the debt and not pay myself a normal living wage. Well, in order for a deal to pencil, you got to service the debt. You got to pay yourself a normal living wage. I mean, you've got to, the way I like to put it is, if you expect me to jump off a cliff, leave my corporate job or leave my job with my benefits and leverage everything I own, put a second mortgage on my house and personal guarantee everything when I buy your business, I have to at least pay myself too, not just service the debt. And I don't really want to buy a job. Okay. But that's what I'm going to do for the first 5 years. Right. So, I would say normalization of earnings reports is what I do. I'm going to normalize the cash flow for a new owner to a market rate rent. I'm going to normalize, that's probably the biggest normalization. And then also your salary. Let's say you're paying yourself $150,000 a year. Okay. Well, that's great. But what if the new buyer, that's added to the cash flow? Well, we normalize that, and the new buyer is going to pay themselves 75. Well, we can take 75 of the 150. We can't add all your 150 back, right? Because 75 is going to flow over to that new. A lot of owners don't understand that. A lot of owners think, well, I'm printing money over here. Yeah, you are. But your real estate's been paid for 20 years. And you're not paying yourself rent. What you should be doing, and I'm not your wise counsel here, but somebody should have advised you to put your real estate in an LLC, and you yourself paying your entity or on the market or some type of rent, something. Okay. Mm-hmm. And then that LLC paying the insurance and property taxes, nice little profit every now and then. Now you got a real estate holding company charging rent to your company. And now we can show that to a buyer. Say, hey, well, they're been paying themselves $5,000 a month. It still cash flows. Oh, okay, no big deal. It's a lot easier to get through that conversation, and it's also a lot easier for you to understand if you're the seller. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. So, you sold ServPro. What was that next morning after the sale like? You ran it for over a decade, and then the next morning, it wasn't yours anymore.
The word that comes to my mind, I have two words: relief. But the biggest word that comes to my mind is freedom. And, freedom to obviously have a weight lifted off of my shoulders. As a business owner, you don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole on risk, because if you do, you can kind of get, you get so deep you can't see the light at the end of the tunnel. So from a risk standpoint, I had freedom. I had zero risk. I didn't have to make payroll every 2 weeks. I didn't have 13 trucks running up and down the road with my phone number on it. I had a lot of different risks that I thought, could have happened that didn't happen, thank the Lord. But the freedom I tell my sellers this, my clients, is, hey, I want you to experience the same freedom I experienced. I call it the door of freedom. And the door of freedom is, if we still do closings at a closing attorney's office, which most businesses, people want to be there and shake the hand of the new owner. So we're going to be there. We're going to walk through the door of the closing attorney's office when it's all said and done. And that's the door of freedom when you get in your car and you got your spouse next to you, God willing, she's there or he's there. And you look at them and you say, wow, we really did it. This really happened. And you're not necessarily, you don't really know. You're kind of, yes, it's going to happen, but like they say, until the money's in the bank, it doesn't matter. But you got a date, and that date will be with you for the rest of your life. You will remember that day no matter what. And for me, it was 10/5/2020. So 10/5, not 10/4, 10/5. So it's really easy for me to remember, but also remember the day I bought my business too. It was August 25th, 2008. So those are two like bookmarks, right? They're two bookends, so to speak, beginning and end. Emotionally, another thing too I'll say is I had to defragment my mind. When you're in the 24-hour emergency service business, you're always watching the weather. You're always thinking about who's going to call. If you're involved in your community, everybody, everybody, you're going to try to you're going to have to get to everybody at once. Who's going to go on priority list? Who's on call? What trucks are ready? I hope the trucks have gas. I mean, all these thoughts are going through your mind. And so I had to defragment and get out of emergency mode. That didn't happen overnight either. That took about a year. Monitoring social media, where there's a fire, scanner apps. I mean, you're listening to everything.
Yeah. You didn't retire. You became a business broker. What were you looking for on the other side of your sale? And how did the business brokerage show up as the next thing you were going to do?
I was looking to help others. Even at ServPro, we helped people in a time of need, a time of desperation, a time of disaster. That's what attracted me to them. To be honest with you, it was more of a mission. We were showing up to be a hero. And so, going into business brokerage, I felt like was a good segue for me because number one, I've sat on the other side of the table. I've sat in their chair, been in their shoes. I know what it's like to have a workers' comp claim, unemployment claim, somebody hit a mailbox, trucks break down. But I also know what it's like to experience all those victories, like I was telling you about earlier, not necessarily from a financial, but like, my general manager and walking with him through life and seeing him grow as a person. That was more fulfilling than any financial moment I had because I was pouring into people. And so I wanted to help others experience that freedom. And I also wanted them to realize that I had been blessed by God to walk through that chapter of my life. And I wanted to help them walk through that chapter. And that's not an easy process, Bob. I didn't know this, but I know it now because I'm on this side. Not all businesses sell. I hate to say that, but they don't. I thought they did. And I want to help people experience what I experienced.
You were alluding to it. You've been on both sides of the table, and now that you're across from the business owner, or at least you're not the owner, what do you see in them that's reminiscent of what you recognize from your own experience? And what do you think they don't know that's coming on how they're going to feel? Like that unanticipated thing that you now recognize.
So I'd say what I recognize from most sellers when I'm sitting there and I'm whether I'm just meeting them, learning about their business. I got one coming up this week, 70-year-old founder, no children, or children have passed, wife has passed. We've got to sell the business. I don't know anything else about it. That's all I know right now. But what I recognize in them that I can relate to, that I feel like I had, is building the sweat equity. the sweat equity is what a lot of people don't see. Most people don't see sweat equity. Most buyers don't want to pay for it, but the public doesn't see it. They don't see the endless nights of working, in the beginning, maybe your wife doing the payroll and you doing, the marketing, the production, the selling, the collecting, the managing. I mean, they don't see all of it. And so your life kind of flashes before your eyes, really, even in the initial conversations. And I can kind of recognize if they see the light at the end of the tunnel or not. And what I tell them is the light's there. Whether you see it or not, it's there. My job is to help you get there. If that's something you want to do. Okay. It's got to be a total buy-in from them. The motivation has to be theirs, not mine. Because I'm going to help them walk through a season of life that is full of mountains and valleys. And I'm the one that's kind of the buffer. So I recognize the sweat equity, and I recognize them kind of seeing their life flash before their eyes. That's just one of those moments. You're just like, oh, okay, wow, I'm really going to do this. Like right now, I've got a situation right now where I've done the valuation. We're ready. I don't know if the seller's ready, but you know what? If they're not ready, it's not the right time.
Yeah.
You said something to, what was the second part of that question? I was trying to remember. You said, what is the thing they don't see that they're about to feel? They don't know. They don't really know the true freedom that they're going to experience when it's over. When it's truly over. Now, some people have transition moments, like there's earnouts and there's, that, like I'm talking about, like you sold, somebody else owns the business, you're helping them through a certain period of time, transition wise, and then you're gone. Okay. So not sticking around for 3 years or anything like that. 3 months. After the first month, they don't want you there. After the first week, they don't want you there.
Yeah.
So I would say they don't know they're about to feel that. And you just kind of take a big exhale when you experience that. And you also, my message to them is if you get to experience that, you experience something that a lot of business owners will never experience for whatever reason. Whether it's a family business, it's got to be passed down. They can't sell. There's a lot of different dynamics there. We used to tell people, I know this is awful, but we used to tell people when they weren't working out of the company, hey, you're free to explore new career opportunities. That basically means you're fired. But it was a nicer way of saying, hey, you're free to explore new career opportunities. This isn't the place for you. We can agree to mutually depart here. That means you don't work here anymore. But, we tried to deliver that in a nice way. That's what the business owner is about to experience. They're about to be free to explore a new opportunity in life.
Yeah. Next chapter.
Yeah.
For the owners that you've been involved with on the transaction, is there a pattern that you observe for the owners that do that post-transaction well and the ones that struggle?
Yes. I would say the owners that I've had owners meet with me one time and literally they're in. I mean, like it is, we're doing this. You're going to sell my business. I know this is going to happen. I mean, they are so confident. And I'm just like, Well, oh, yeah, okay. Yeah, I am. Yeah, absolutely. I'm with you 100%. I don't know a whole lot about the business at this point, right? I haven't got the tax returns or anything. And those owners, most of the time, they have plan B. They have the next chapter, not necessarily fully mapped out, but they have the next chapter outlined. They kind of know what they're wanting to do next. Whether it's buy a lake house, RV across America, go spend a couple of months at my farm in Kansas. I could go down the laundry list. One of them's plan right now is, hey, I want to hang out with my grandchildren. I talked to a seller the other day I just sold a business for. A little follow up. Hey, how you doing? What's going on? Tell me about some things you're doing. He was like, you know what? I got to take my granddaughter to tennis practice. She called me up 9:00. Wanted me to take her to tennis practice at 10:00. I'd never done that. He's 73 years old, I think. I think he's about 73. He's never done that before. And he was like, you know what? I get to do that now. And that's what he wants to do. Like, he just wants to be present.
Yeah.
Because he hasn't been.
We've talked quite a bit before this show, and you describe yourself as a faith-centered advisor. You founded Rising Branch around the idea that business is stewardship. How does that show up in the way that you work with a seller who is about to let go of that business they built?
Stewardship is, a lot of people think stewardship is monetary. They associate stewardship with, well, how am I going to bless others financially, or what am I going to do with my money? And one of the things I ask them is, hey, one of the things I want you to be thinking about is, what's your true purpose here? What do you think? What do you think your true purpose here is with this blessing of this business, and then now you're about to sell it? And how can you be a good steward of that blessing? Okay, so that's kind of like some people say peeling back the onion. There's layers. There's layers and layers and layers. Sometimes business owners are head down. Well, most of the time, they're head down, they're grinding, and they very seldom look up. And so now they have an opportunity to kind of say, what's my purpose? How am I going to use this blessing that God gave me to bless others? That's what a stewardship is. That's what steward is. A steward is to bless others with the blessing that you've received. So what is that? What are those blessings? Well, it can be your time. We just talked about just being present. That was more of a posterity blessing that he's going to have for his grandchildren. So time is a blessing. Obviously money's a blessing. But I would say time, money, your spiritual gifts. I encourage all my sellers to take a spiritual gifts test. They can go on our pinelake.org, my church, and you don't have to be a member, and they have an app, and you can take a spiritual gifts test, and in 5 minutes, literally kind of give you a outline of what God's blessed you with spiritually. And then also there's a servant component to that. Like, how do you want to give back to the community in a servant way? Do you have a nonprofit that you're passionate about, that you might have supported financially, but you haven't been able to give them your time and your wisdom? Business owners, in my opinion, have so much to give, not only to just their employees and their vendors and their suppliers, but the community. And then post sale, they are a walk-in encyclopedia of how to run a good organization. And I think that, Bob, there's a gap there. There's a gap in how those organizations can use business owners as a resource. And the business owner doesn't necessarily know how to tap into the organization. So there's a white space.
I think a lot of the business owners discount that which they know and the value that that intellectual property has, in the community. I just think it's a gap. Um, we talked earlier about the stewardship and leadership and delegation is developing the next leader, and the fellow you had lunch with, a week and a half ago. Um, for a business owner who's been the center of everything for the 15 or 20 years, what does that really look like in your experience when they finally hand that over?
I think it really depends on how the next leader was developed. Was it an internal? Was it an external leader that was brought in? If it's if we're just talking about transitioning the next generation of leaders, if it's a new business owner, obviously, did they buy into your culture? Do they believe in some of the same passions that you had? There's a lot of different variables there. It's a slow transition normally for someone that's going to be someone that's internal, and that takes intentionality from the current leader to recognize the next generation of who could come up. And I use the story of I reference the Bible a lot, but I mean that's just who I am. But I reference the story of David, the King David. David was a shepherd, and he was not the one that you would have thought. But being a shepherd prepared him for a couple of things. Everybody knows David and Goliath, story of him killing the giant. Well, how did he kill the giant? Well, the reason why he killed the giant was because he had a slingshot. And why did he have a slingshot? Because he was a shepherd and he was guarding his flock. So he had wrestled bears and killed them and lions before. When he saw Goliath, he was, man, this is nothing. I've handled the guys like this before. They would eat me if I didn't kill them. And then fast forward, he becomes king, and he kind of has to shepherd his people. And how did he prepare himself for that? So I mean, it's intentionality of developing that next leader. I hope that answers the question somewhat.
Yes. You focus on Mississippi and the Southeast market. What do you think is specific about exit dynamics in your market that perhaps somebody in Chicago or Denver might not understand?
Most buyers, even Mississippi buyers, they're so eager. And I'm talking to the buyers first. In Mississippi, if you can't tell, we talk a little slower. Okay. We move a little slower. We drive a little slower than everybody else. And so I tell people, if you're not from here, or if you're coming to buy a business here and you want to relocate here, by the way, it's a great place to relocate. If you can bear the relative humidity like we were talking about in the summer, you can play golf till you're about 10 months old. Or not 10 months old. You can play golf for about 10 months. Sorry. Almost till December, depending on when. So March to something like that. I would say the biggest thing is in Mississippi that's different is you've got to build the rapport. I know everybody wants the numbers and they want to check the boxes. Yeah, oh, well, it's got to do this, 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 or I'm not interested. Sometimes you got to look beyond just numbers and really hear somebody's story. And I would say the biggest thing that people miss here, and I can't speak for other areas, is they're not asking the current owner or founder, what are the potential things that you would do to this business, or the things that you would like to add on if you owned it for another 30 years. Sometimes they're just tired, they're comfortable, it's provided a great living for them. Technology's bypassed them, like we talked about with ServPro owners. And that's an easy question. Sometimes we ask the question as business brokers when we're interviewing sellers, with an unlimited amount of time and money, which nobody has, but everybody likes to think that they do. What are 2 to 3 things that you could do to double this business in the next 5 years? And they kind of look at you like, what was that? And so I just kind of, break it down. What are two or three things, if you had an unlimited amount of time and money, that you would do this business? Didn't matter how long it take. Didn't matter how much money you got. How much it cost. What would you do to double this business in 5 years? And they're like, oh, yeah, well, that's easy. I'd do this. I'd do that. Okay. Those are great value additions.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm going like, yeah, it's so common sense that folks don't do it. They don't.
No.
You know, go ahead.
Bob, we're in Mississippi, we're more relational than transactional.
Yeah.
You know,
Well,
you could,
I grew up down in that country too. So,
yeah,
yeah.
you know, Tennessee, you know, we're the same. We're just a distant neighbor.
Northerners, Tennessee, for sure. You know, if someone's, if somebody's in Mississippi and they've been running a company for 10 or 15 years and they know they need to start thinking about what's next, where do they find you? And what does that first conversation look like?
Well, first of all, Vavrunek is not a common name. So if you Google Vince Vavrunek, you're not going to get 10 of them, most likely.
Yeah.
Last time I did that, by the way, Google yourself, you have fun. But last time I did that, I'm the only one. So I like to tell people that's a good Southern name, and they look at me kind of funny, and I say, well, it's Southern Czechoslovakian, but I'm in Mississippi. And then I would say LinkedIn, Bob, because I mean, like, that's where I'm at the most. I'm on LinkedIn. I respond to all the inquiries. You know, I manage my own page. And so a lot of business owners I connect with on LinkedIn. So I would be the first thing, Google my name or ask Chat GPT or whatever, Vince Vavrunek, how to get in touch with him.
Okay.
And also if I'm on LinkedIn.
That's how we found each other.
That's right. Yeah.
So, you know, you've been on both sides of the table. You're the founder that built it and the seller who let it go, and the broker watches people go through it all the time. 6 years after your sale, looking back, what do you now know that you wish you knew then?
Yeah, I think I might have talked to you about this when we first got on a phone call. I wish I knew about some alternative ways to give to the kingdom through my proceeds prior to walking through that. I'm not a financial advisor. I'm not a financial guru. But, here on this side of the table, I have watched a couple of different things happen, and I've been able to see some really neat things that I'm like, ooh, I wish I would have done that. I wish I could have been able to do that. So that was one. The other one would be, we talked about head down. In ServPro, they called it the whirlwind. That's Monday morning when you walk into the office and, 3 guys don't show up and your office manager calls in sick and the phone's ringing off the hook and everything you thought you were going to work on rolls out the window. And sometimes I wish I would have just risen above to that 60,000 foot view and got out of the whirlwind a little bit. The business owner has so much influence, and I talk about kingdom first mindset, kingdom impact, and we just talked about that gap, that white space of the resources. As a business owner, if you currently own a business, or even when you're out and you're not, you still have all the resources, you still have all the knowledge. But when you're in the trenches, when you're in the whirlwind, your potential impact is exponential. It's infinite. The ripple effect, I call it. Because some people say business is mission. That is a real mission. That's where people spend most of their time.
Mm-hmm.
That's an ecosystem in itself. And so as I look back on it, I know I participated and I know I poured into people, but sometimes I wish I would have just kind of like risen up look down and just feeling like, okay, these are all the tentacles here. This is the impact that I'm making, and then this is the potential impact that I could have. So I would say I wish I would have maybe known that then, but I don't know if it was possible.
It's sometimes you just kind of got to get there in order to be able to do an after action and say, and recognize. But, Vince, you and I have talked quite a bit, before the episode and on the episode. I really appreciate you taking the time and, sharing your views and your insights. This episode for folks, incredibly valuable and useful. And, whether you're the founder, pre or post exit, or the professional serving the business owner, there's wisdom and experience in here on both sides of the table. With that being said, this is the Exit Series. If you know of a founder who's sold or is about to, or a broker or an attorney or a value accelerator who's been across the table at the closing or about to, send them this episode and subscribe to wherever you listen. We'll see you next time.